Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack, and I have back with me Rachel Allen.
Hi.
And we are going to pick up where we left off in our last podcast episode together, talking about ownership versus partnership. So, in the last episode, we went through kind of a timeline of women's rights and the evolution of really women being recognized as human beings who should own themselves and not be owned by fathers or husbands. And then we're going to pick up today.
Yeah. So I think that like what we went through last time, I do think that that's really important because if we just start with relationships need to be equal and we don't explain like how they haven't been equal
Right.
for centuries, for millennia, then it loses its weight, right? But really, we don't start seeing even the idea of equal relationships or equal partnerships show up in marriage books or literature until the 90s. And that's when we really start seeing, right? Like even then, it's really subtle because there's a lot of invisible labor that happens for women, even in like when you look at the 80s and the movies that came out in the 80s around like working moms and women getting divorced or wanting divorces, like they were still pretty hard for women to like, right? It was that like you can have it all kind of idea, which meant that like you had to do it all. And I can't remember, there's which movie is it with Diane Keaton where she has a baby in the 80s. I can't remember the name of it.
I don't remember.
I can see I keep wanting to say Kramer versus Kramer, but that's the divorce movie
Right.
with Meryl Streep.
Yeah.
But I can't remember the name of the one with Diane Keaton. Anyway, right? Like it was literally about like you can like you can be a great mom and have a full-time job and like keep the house and like do all these things. And the reality is like that's just not possible. It's not feasible.
Right.
And so in the 90s, we started to seeing a lot of burnout from that. And really a request of like, we've got to set boundaries and we've got to start creating some space for like women to be able to like ask for help in the home. Where you and I often talk about like, you both are adults, you both own the home, you're both responsible for the space.
Right.
But that's, 30 years later. And so we don't really, really, really start to see that until very, very recently. This idea of actually relationships can be equal. And this is what that actually looks like, right? It actually looks like men parenting, doing chores around the house, women working, right? And finding the balance in the individual relationship. And you and I talked about recently, John Gottman said that for relationships to be at their best, men have to be willing to take influence from their female partners. And that's not really required for women to take influence from their male partners.
Well, it is required.
Well, it's required,
right.
But it didn't have to be stated, right?
Right.
Like it wasn't required that was stated because women always have.
Right.
Right. Like women take a lot of influence from men in general in our society, but especially their male partners. So,
and I think like he had from his research, I mean, him and his wife, Dr. Julie Gottman, but they created this, I think they call it the sound relationship house, right? Sound meaning like stable or functional.
Yeah.
And so they had different aspects of what made the sound relationship house, right? So I think it had things, oh gosh, this is taking me back a long time, but we do have magnets about this. Yeah. I just don't have them here.
I know. I was just thinking about the magnets.
There was connection and communication, but the higher up you go, you get to things. I think one of the higher things that he was looking at, I mean, communication and connection maybe forms the basis, or I think in
I think
his,
safety
was the
safety is the
foundation.
foundation.
Communication and connectedness were the walls of the house. But then you get into where he talks about accepting influence. And John Gottman also wrote a book with, I'm forgetting his name. I want to say his last name was like Goodrich or Goodman or something like that. I think the title, if I'm remembering correctly, is called Why Men Abuse Women.
Yeah.
And so that was a pretty groundbreaking book, maybe in the 90s, I want to say, looking at the factors that underlie, in what we would call today intimate partner violence, what we called back then domestic violence. But this was a key factor that they found in their research of accepting influence. And he states in his research, like you were just saying, this is something that men need to be aware of because women are already doing it. And it goes back to this history of ownership and patriarchy. Women never really had the option to not accept influence because their safety depended on that.
Right.
Their survival depended on that. Any accomplishment they had depended on that. And so women do accept influence from males.
Yeah.
And maybe not always in the best circumstances. And so, he talked about like really to even the power dynamic in the relationship, we had to have males accepting influence. So let's talk about like, what does he mean when he talks about accepting influence?
Yeah. So, I mean, the best way that I can like simplify this is like where you listen, try to understand, and try to see the perspective of your partner and use that as a way to inform your decisions, inform the conversation. Right. It's that like my wife suggested this book, so I'm going to read it because it said something to her. It meant something to her. It, like one of the things that I always think about is like the way that we gender movies, right? Like that's a chick flick or, guy films really don't get labeled guy films. They're action films or they're adventure films, right? But they're not really called like guy films and chick flicks. They're chick flicks, which separates it. And then the rest of the movies, right?
As though women aren't interested in action films or superhero films.
Right. But I think that there is a level of that too, that like there's a lot in those female oriented films that say a lot about how women want men to show up in relationships, their expectation of relationships, their expectation of romance that like men just don't take influence from. And when you see like romance and relationships in action films, like James Bond is the one I'm thinking about, right? Like those are not really good relationships. I mean, I don't know that some of the chick flicks relationships are really good either, but it's about that. Like if you're only getting a male view of what it's like to be in the relationship, then you're not hearing your partner and you're not showing up in the way that she needs you to. And it's not like this is like singular focus, right? Like the reality is from Emily Nagoski to John Gottman to Brene Brown to like every boundary book I've read.
Right.
It's this idea of like, you are not going to want to be relational, sexual, or like intimate with your partner if your partner can't show up and help you.
Right.
So if you're working 40 hours a week and primary caretaker of the kids and primary caretaker of the house, like you don't have anything else to give your partner.
Or if that is the only way they show up,
yeah,
that's going to feel like them taking something else, the way the kids do, the way the house does, the way all of this does, because maybe they're doing emotional labor. I did a podcast episode, the last one, talking about that. And so if they're doing emotional labor all the time and you're not somebody who shows up and shares with that, or the only way you show up is to ask for sex. I mean, I tell clients this all the time. That's a very different kind of sex. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that I would qualify that as really good sex.
Right.
If you're coming, simply for the fact that you want sex. I mean, I'm not saying you can't have sex under those circumstances. Trying to be careful with my wording because I know YouTube doesn't like certain words and we put our podcast on YouTube. So that's where I'm going with is if you come because you have a desire for sex, that's like, sure, sex can happen under those circumstances, but is it maybe what we would say the best kind of sex? Probably not. And I think we have to recognize that when we can be partners, when your female partner can lean on you mm-hmm. and you know how to show up and you know how to offer support. And then you know how to, like, maybe she's had a stressful day with the kids. You know how to take care of the kids. You can step in, you can do those things and be like, okay, just take a break, whatever you need. When my kids were young, sometimes my husband would be like, just go. Mm-hmm. And I spend a lot of time sometimes just driving, sometimes just walking through Target. I wouldn't even necessarily buy anything.
Right.
I needed to get away because they're a lot. Like little kids are a lot. And they should be. I'm not saying that that's wrong or that's bad. It just requires a lot of caregiving. And, sometimes it feels like it's never enough, which it probably isn't.
Yeah. And, I think that there's a level of that in which we have to listen to that influence. And I do think that there is a piece of this. And I see this with my younger clients, right? So my younger millennials, Gen Zers, mm-hmm. That the men get that.
Yeah.
But they don't know what to do with that. Right. And so they understand, I need to be a better partner. Mm-hmm. And I almost, in some of my younger millennials and Gen Zers, right? It's almost flipped a little bit where the female partners are the ones saying no, you should be a partner.
Right.
And you should be able to show up like this. And my male partners of the same partnership, they're confused at how. Right. I feel like I am doing that. I am doing this. I am doing that. And I think that there is a level of this level of influence, what this influence means is are you listening to how? Mm-hmm. Right. Are we talking about how? And how did these family dynamics from our extended family get in the way? Because if you're showing up as a partner, is that is that allowing her to be in this partnership? Mm-hmm. Or are there family of origin dynamics in which she's still required to do the emotional labor? Because that happens for a lot of adult children. And we have to talk about that. But
I think prior to so I'm a Gen X, uh-huh. You're a millennial, an older millennial, right?
I'm an older millennial.
But I think Gen X didn't really have models for these types of partnership marriages.
Right.
I think it's a mixed bag with Gen X as to whether you started to move your relationship more into this egalitarian type of relationship or not, or just followed the models that have been given forever.
Right.
And so my kids are Gen Z, right? And so I think they've had a model of that. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have a model for that.
Right.
So we were figuring it out as we went. We're kind of blazing this path and, we made mistakes. Of course we made mistakes.
Right. And I will say too, at least for my cohort, right? The people that I knew growing up as an elder millennial or younger Gen Z, because that was mm-hmm. that, we're in that space where we still had Walkmans and no internet and cable TV. But like there, in my experience, right, there wasn't a requirement to stay in the relationship and negotiate what equality looks like.
Right.
For most of the people that I know, if that was being requested or asked for by the female, it wasn't met and divorce happened.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like there was just a massive rupture. And if you look at it, my generation was also the first generation in which parents could get a no contest divorce in most of the states.
Mm-hmm.
Like women could. And so they didn't have to stay.
Right.
And
to be clear, like No Fault Divorce, I'm reading this book and I have to take it in doses because it's a hard read, meaning like I feel like I can only take so many gut punches as I'm reading the book before I'm like, and I'm taking a break and reading some fiction because that is hard.
Yeah.
But it's on coercive control, which is also mainly a male issue. It's males, using the patriarchal systems that are still in place in our country against women to take their autonomy. Mm-hmm. It's a way of abuse, but we don't really. There are states in the United States who have laws against them, not criminal laws, civil laws. The UK and Scotland have criminal laws against this. Anyway, I'll get to that whenever I finish that book because I'm taking it in small doses. But I think, in that book initially, like in chapter 2, I think it is, he gives a timeline of progress when it comes to domestic violence. And he talked about how big of a factor no fault divorce was in allowing women to get out of violent situations. There's still a risk. Mm-hmm. There's still, that's a high risk time. We still know that, like, getting a restraining order or actually leaving is a very high risk time for females in those types of relationships. But prior to that, she had a hard time getting out. Right. And so in the 80s, we saw things like women killing their husband and, there was kind of an abused woman syndrome type of thing. There were movies made about this. I'm thinking of, I think it was with Farrah Fawcett, and I think it was called The Burning Bed.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
those
like, that's how they got out of those relationships. And they couldn't necessarily, they tried, like, with some time, they tried to use this, like, I was abused and didn't have an option to leave, as a defense. Early on, it didn't work. There was no really recognition of that.
Right.
And then, we started to get some education around that, at least in our legal systems. And then, we moved to a no-fault divorce in all 50 states. Some party platforms are trying to undo that.
Right.
Which, again, that I was reading the book when all of that came out, and I was like, I'm just going to need to stop right now for a moment, because just recognizing how much that propelled, I think, even the benefit of relationships. Because again, if you view your marriage as you owning somebody,
that's not relational.
That's not relational. And it increases the chances of it being abusive. Mm-hmm. And so, like, just being able to leave those relationships. There was still, in the 80s, some stigma around divorce, but you could, in the 80s and 90s, you could start leaving marriages. You could have a job to help support you and your children.
Bank account, your own insurance. You could rent at that point. I think that there's also a level of this, right, as you're talking. And like, you and I talk about consent all the time. Right. Like, it's the foundation of the work that we do, is that we have to make sure that we're getting consent. And you and I talk a lot about informed consent. Nowhere else in our society is consent so vague as it is in sex and relationships. Right. Like,
but it doesn't need to be.
But it doesn't need to be.
It's a very simple thing to understand. It is not this complex issue. I think in many ways, on purpose, left it very vague.
But the reality is, like, one of the things that you and I say a lot is, if you cannot say no, you cannot give a yes.
Right.
Right. And I think that this is the thing with relationships and marriages is like, if divorce is never on the table,
Mm-hmm.
then a real relationship isn't either. Right?
Right.
Like, this is that level of like, you have to work to get divorce off
Mm-hmm.
the table. You have to work, like, because there's always an out.
Right.
And if the relationship gets bad enough, you can leave.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to stay.
Right.
There is no have to stay in this relationship. We can make a lot of excuses for that
Mm-hmm.
and create a lot of leaps, but that as adults, we do not have to stay in any relationship.
Mm-hmm. Which when no fault divorce became a thing, and I heard this in the church that I grew up in, they would talk about how wrong this was,
Yes.
and divorce is an easy way out, which
Yeah.
let me clarify now. I kind of thought this at the time because I was in a family where divorce needed to happen.
Right.
And I just thought, I don't think divorce is an easy option.
Mm-hmm.
But we started to see a rise in the numbers of divorce. Of course we did. Because prior to that, it was very hard to get a divorce. It was hard to get alimony. It was hard to, you couldn't have a job.
Right.
And so typically women would get custody of the kids, but they would not get any money to go with that. And they couldn't get a job. And so what's supposed to happen there?
Right.
Well, they're going to stay because that's usually just not an option for them to not be able to care for their kids at a basic level. And so we saw this huge rise in the divorce stats because a lot of marriages that needed to end, including my parents, did.
Yeah.
And I saw that as a good thing when my brother and I went to my mom and were like, please get a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And, at the time she was like, well, I was waiting until your younger siblings are older. I'm waiting till everybody's 18. And we just said, you're not doing anyone favors by staying married until they're 18. Like, just get out now. Like, you will be doing them a favor to get out now and not raise them in this environment. And so what we've seen actually, I think in the last 10 years is a slow decline in the divorce rate.
Mm-hmm.
Not drastically, but it's starting to ebb back down because I think when you don't own your wife, you have to continue working on the marriage.
Right.
You have to continue working on the relationship.
Right.
You might be aware that I need to accept influence from her. Mm-hmm. I can't just treat her like my property and then be like, well, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? Oh, you don't like that? Tough.
Right.
And so we've started to see, number one, I think people are getting married later.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing because they have more information and data about this person before they are in a relationship. I think Utah has the lowest average range of marriage, but there,
right.
That's not surprising.
Also, according to the Pew Research studies, right, like the national average of non-religious divorces
Mm-hmm.
is astronomically lower
Mm-hmm.
than those in religious communities. Like, religious communities are getting divorced at a higher rate. And the belief is that most religious communities are getting married younger.
Uh-huh.
They're, like most evangelical and like Judeo-Christian religious communities, or I guess any kind of conservative religious
Mm-hmm.
community, right, kind of requires this like marriage before sex
Mm-hmm.
belief. And so people get married to have sex
more. Which means it's going to be faster. They're not going to know each other for a very long time before they're married.
Where, people who are claiming to be seculars or nons, like non-religious, they're just moving in, right? Like they're moving in with each other.
They're trying it out before they have this legal commitment.
Yeah. And there was always this belief of like, well, moving in just means like you're getting what you want without this commitment.
Yeah. And why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?
Which I hate that.
I do too.
I hate that saying.
I do too.
Like, that's just, first of all, women are not cows.
Right.
Gross.
Also, like, why wouldn't I want to know if there was an expiration date on this?
Right.
So whether it's milk or marriages and relationships, like, we need to know, we need to have informed consent before we make those commitments.
Right. And we're not seeing that as true, right? Like
Right.
couples now in the Gen Z millennial range, younger millennials, they are cohabitating longer. And usually when they are choosing to get married, they're choosing to get married because they're wanting to move into like having children.
Right.
Which makes sense in terms of like legal terms and healthcare and things like that. But so far those marriages are lasting longer. And doing
well, and how many partners have we worked with when we're asking them, like, when did sex become problematic in the relationship? And not all of them, I don't even know if it's a majority of them, but it's enough of them to say the first night of our honeymoon.
Yeah.
Because prior to getting married, they had no data on the sexual piece.
Right.
I mean, they might have, but they didn't realize the data that they had.
Right.
And that's always heartbreaking to me. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, for me as a mom, I started questioning that religious belief that I had been brought up with, as, regarding no sex before marriage. Because I had enough of those clients that I thought, I don't know that I want that for my girls.
It's also an insane amount of pressure, right?
Yes.
Like, you've been told not to have sex your whole life until this night. And then magically, a switch is going to flip and everything's going to be fine. And that's just not how it works. But then there's a massive amount of performance anxiety and pressure and expectation from like your community,
right?
Which also I think is weird and a little gross. But yeah, like that's a lot. That is a lot to put on something that's very natural in the human experience. But I mean, coming back to this idea of like a partnership, right? Coming back to this idea of ownership versus partnership, like sex has historically been owned.
Right.
Bodies have historically been owned. And, in my religious upbringing, the scripture, like, to become one was the foundation for that like when you get married, you no longer own your body as a female. It belongs to your husband. And I just think that that's a really bad idea around partnership in general. But what it also says is, like, women don't get autonomy in their thoughts or ideas, or right. Like, it all comes back to this idea of influence, of if we can let that go and say, like, no, these are two individuals making something together. It's a group project.
Right. Where both of you have to be involved in the work, not the group project where one person does nothing, but their name goes on the paper.
It's like in my grad school where we had group projects, but we were individually graded by our peers. Okay. So, like,
that would not be nice.
Right. So, like, we got an overall like group grade, but then we as peers got to individually grade each other on like how we showed up and how we, managed working as a team, and like, did we get our stuff done on time, and like things like that. It's that kind of group project,
right?
Where, like, look, like, overall, the marriage is going to be healthier the way that the individuals show up. The relationship will be healthier, even if it's not marriage, right? Like, a long-standing, committed, monogamous relationship will be healthier if the two people who say they're doing the work are doing the work.
Right.
And you can't just give that to one person and expect, like,
it to work.
It to work. Like, it just won't work that way.
Right. And it shouldn't.
Right.
I mean, we can look back and maybe some marriages worked, and there were probably certain characteristics of those marriages that we would still advocate for today. But a lot of the relationships, especially when ownership became abusive or dominant, the other person didn't really have autonomy, and that wasn't like even recognized
Mm-hmm.
in the relationship. I mean, that's obviously that's not going to be healthy. That's not going to be a good model to pass down, but it is what we have had. And so I think we're at this time where the relationship model is moving more towards egalitarian, and that requires, and John Gottman talks about this. He says, you know, I mean, I think he talks about, I don't remember which book this is in, but he talks about how, the days when patriarchy served a purpose
Are
was
over.
well over by the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
maybe prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, we just didn't need to hunt for food. You might do it for sport or something, but like it's not necessary for survival. We're not relying necessarily on brute strength, physical strength. And he talked about like if men particularly are not evolving with this move towards egalitarian relationships, that will hold us back as a species. I remember reading that thinking like, wow, that will hold us back as a species, which also makes sense. Like we need people to be evolving in order to
You're right.
move.
I mean, I think it has for the last, I don't know, at least 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Patriarchy has held us back as a species.
Yes.
I mean, like if you look at how we existed, like, so we had this very well, we still do, right? We still have this very patriarchal idea of like how things are structured and should be run. But in colonial America, when we, the 1400s, when we started discovering the Americas, the first people had female leaders,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was a more egalitarian society across the board. Most tribes had female chiefs, female leaders, female wise
Mm-hmm.
people, right? And instead of us taking that and saying like, oh, this is a better way to do things,
Mm-hmm.
Western Europe just decided like, no, like that doesn't make sense. And so they wouldn't allow the female leaders to the meetings, right? So like when we have all these drawings and paintings of like the the British meeting with the chiefs and things like that, they weren't. They were meeting with the next highest male because the women weren't even allowed in the rooms.
Well, there was that belief basically, right? I mean, we're talking about town square meetings.
Yes.
That's where the men would go. And the women who went there lived in brothels, were prostitutes, right?
Right.
Like they were not the good women.
Right.
They weren't the ones that they were getting married to. Those women stayed at home.
Right.
And yeah, they had a lot to do at home. So it made sense that they're at home, milking the cows, taking care of the kids, all of this type of stuff.
Right.
But they've pointed out, feminist scholars have pointed out how much power was literally taken from women by telling them, good women don't go into the town square.
Yeah.
Good women stay home.
Right.
And bad women are in the town square.
Right.
But I mean, they didn't have a voice because they were in the town square. They served a different purpose. But it was the men making the decisions.
Right.
It was the men talking about how to solve problems. It was the men voting for leaders.
Right. And I mean, like, if you look at it, right, like that was the whole problem with Hamilton.
Yeah.
Is that like there are these really fantastic women in Alexander Hamilton's life that he just didn't take influence from.
Right.
And if he had, where would we have been? Right. Like, and that's right. So like, I do think it's held us back. And I think that it holds us back in our relationships now in so many ways, because like the other thing is women have been building deep emotional relationships with other women for millennia. Like we know how to do that. That is the language we talk about. And the reality is like a lot of women are just realizing like, I don't need a male relationship if they're not going to show up for me this way. Which makes a lot of people angry. This is what starts the red pill, like non-consent, like you should just like try harder if she says no, like all the alpha bro stuff out there. Is really this pushback of like women just being like, I'm not interested in if you can't show up,
right,
like emotionally equal, emotionally available,
which is it's calling into question this long held patriarchal belief that men were entitled.
Yeah.
Men were entitled to getting married. Men were entitled to having children. Men were entitled to sex.
Right.
And all of that is pushing back on that to say, actually, you need to do some things.
Yeah.
Before I'll commit with you. And these are some of those things, right? It's pushing back on that idea of just being entitled. Because if you're entitled to those things, if that's your God-given right, then why would you do something else?
Right.
Why would you accept influence from women?
Right. Where that's not what most of the female population is saying right now.
Right.
I mean, we've got some pockets that are doing some weird things, but right, like as a whole, I think women are starting to realize like, oh no, like I have the freedom to have the relationships that I want with the people that I want. I don't have to beg you to show up for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as a whole, women are also starting to see that like marriage doesn't actually benefit them. There's no benefit to marriage for women in terms of equality or relational, like it doesn't help women. And so they are waiting longer or not getting married. And that makes sense. And if we want to see that coupleships can last and coupleships can stay together, I don't know that more marriage is the solution. Like, I don't know that marriage is a solution, but I do think that showing up and listening and letting our partner have influence on us and being influenced by our partner in good ways is really important.
Yeah. I remember when I was in college, and at the time it was a 2-year community college, but I did live like 4.5 hours from home. And I've talked about this professor before on the podcast. He was one of my favorite professors. I talked to him. I don't know why he took a particular interest in me and my education, but he did. And I would talk with him. I took most of the classes he taught. I just don't really, for me, foreign language doesn't click. I wish it did. So I didn't take, he also taught German classes. I didn't take those. But everything else that he taught, I took. I also ended up talking to him a lot about the other classes I was in. He would give me speeches or essays to read, and we would talk about them. And he had a profound impact on me. I would say he was probably the first father figure in my life that I felt was positive. And I remember corresponding with him just before I got married because he was going to write a letter for my graduate program for me to get into a graduate program. And as we were talking, I mentioned that, I was married. And he said to me, I'm really disappointed to hear that. And I was like, what? And he said, I've just never thought of you as somebody's wife. I've always thought of you as a person, like with intelligence and creativity and drive. And I was like, I still have that. And he's like, I just hope your husband, and he was married, but he's like, I just hope your husband doesn't start introducing you as his wife without your name. And I did say to him, like, I wouldn't have gotten married if that's who I was marrying. And anyway, so he passed away this professor passed away while I was at grad school. And so again, it was that idea for him. And he knew I grew up in the LDS culture. That was the religion of, my youth, and even at the time that he knew me. And I'm sure he had some of the awareness. He was not religious, but I'm sure he had some of that awareness of what the religion taught and was making some assumptions. And fortunately, that hasn't been the case in my relationship. But I think even more so, we talk about partners. We talk about, this is my partner.
Mhm.
We talk about, sometimes instead of the word marriage, we talk about a partnership.
Yeah.
Which I think is progress in and of itself.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, like, I've stopped using even the terms like husband and wife,
Mhm.
right? And sometimes I catch myself, but I've started saying my partner, my
Mhm.
spouse.
Yeah.
Because husband is a caretaker or someone who has ownership over, right? Like, it actually comes from the idea of like animal husbandry,
Mhm.
where you are literally owning and taking care of like sheep or whatever, right? Like that is what that comes from. Where the term wife comes from a German root, that where there were male and women that were wives. Like it was like a midwife, or like wiffery was someone who like assisted in things.
Yeah.
And so someone who assists is the wife. Someone who owns is the husband.
Right. The person they're assisting.
Yeah. So just like word history, right? We've moved to spouse and partner in our relationship because that feels more equal. And even, right, like homes are not, they're not calling them master suites anymore. They're calling them owner suites, right? Like there's a reason that we're shifting this language.
Right. Yeah. So what does that look like? I mean, I think for most men, if they're not doing some type of work and educating themselves and informing themselves and becoming more self-aware, you're going to fall into some of these patriarchal traps because patriarchy is still the dominant structure that we have. And so, sometimes like if I'm working with a couple, I had a couple I was working with just a couple weeks ago, and she was expressing some concern, like we have to do all of these things in the next year. And I mean, it is a daunting list that they were going to have to like buy a new car, and or not, maybe not brand new, but like her car was definitely well
Needing
past
to be
its
replaced.
expiration date. And we're going to have to, so big things like this. They had multiple big things that they were looking at. And his response to her was, I know that you're stressed. It's going to be okay. And I was like, excuse me. But I kind of leaned forward and I said, let me help you out, which is common for me to do. Right. And I said, because I work with both of them individually and then we do some joint sessions. And I said, I know that stresses you out too, because you talked to me about financial stress. So this is not something she stresses about. This is something you stress about. And telling her it's going to be okay is not going to help her. Like that's actually dismissing her emotions that are coming up. And in order for you to actually connect with her in this moment, you have to connect to the emotions you have. And you have to let yourself go there. You don't have to like be this savior in this moment, because what are you saving her from? These are stressful things. I don't have answers for you, but I know you don't have answers too. And just acknowledging that and saying, I know this is really stressful. It's stressful for me too. And I don't know how we're going to do all of that in the next year. We'll figure it out together. We'll talk about it. We'll take one step at a time. That is going to do way more to calm down the stress, because we're building a connection. But you have to connect to you and be honest about that in order to show up for somebody else emotionally.
Yeah.
You can't show up intellectually for somebody who needs you to show up emotionally. That's going to be a mismatch, and that's usually going to result in disconnection.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, the importance of, like, communication, right? Like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like, communication is key. And, like, I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, like
which means men have a lot of emotional work to do. And we're fortunate we're working with men who are doing that emotional work.
Yeah.
And we do see them evolve.
Yeah.
Which is great, seeing them evolve as a person as they start to do.
And they want to.
Yes.
And I think that that's the thing that's really important too, is like, you have to want to do this work because it is hard work.
You don't have to want to every session.
Right.
Overall, you have to know this is a good thing that you're doing.
Right. You can have sessions that are like, nah, not today.
Yeah.
But I also think, right, like going to this idea of like, even like seeing that and knowing that, like, I have noticed, right, there are self-help books geared towards men and self-help books geared towards women. And I always get asked, like, where do you find this information? And there's some really, really good female authors out there that do this, that touch on this, right? Like Brene Brown, this is her entire, like emotional intelligence is her entire job.
Right.
And John and Julie Gottman, which I get, like it's John and, but they're partners, and they're partners that seem to get it.
Yes.
Their work is phenomenal on stuff like this. And so like recognize,
and it looks like they practice what they preach.
Yes. Right. You know, like we're not in there. We don't go to dinner with John and Julie.
Right.
Maybe one day, but yeah, they seem to genuinely practice like what they're talking about, what they're preaching. And I think that that's part of the thing with Brene too, is she's pretty honest about her flaws in her books and in her podcast. And I think that kind of honesty and accountability shows us how we can be messy in relationships and still show up.
Yeah. I've actually seen John and Julie Gottman present before. And there's even small ways that you see how this has just become so integrated into their relationship, where sometimes maybe the person that introduces them, they give the introduction and then they turn the time over to John. And John just sits there, and then Julie gets up and is like, oh, it's my turn. I'm going. And like, I wonder if they start with her. I wondered at the time I saw that presentation, if they started with her on purpose because they assumed that the time would be turned over to John, and John would just sit back and let Julie take the lead, and had no problem doing that. Right. But there was also I'm not thinking of them right now, just little things throughout their presentation that you can tell this has become the norm in their relationship.
Well, there is, because I did the Gottman 1 training that was, like them doing the training. And there were a couple of times, right, where like John would say, look, like I'm the researcher, but like Julie's the one, like Julie is the therapist. Like she learned how to like actually like shift the system.
Right.
I learned what the system was.
Right.
Julie started coming up with these things of like, hey, if this is the problem, this is the solution.
Right.
And he's like,
and helping people to integrate that change.
And so like he does a lot around the like, I could tell you if a marriage was going to fail by watching them for 5 minutes. But Julie is really the one that kind of said like, okay, but how do we stop that?
Right. Now that we know, and they can predict within, it's like 90.
It's insane.
6%.
It's insane how
whether a relationship is going to last long term and be healthy or not. And like that's amazing that they, I mean, and their research gives them a lot of data. So it's on the one hand, it's not surprising that they can be that precise, but it's also surprising for them to be that precise. And so, what good is it to identify the problem and have all this research supporting how you identified the problem if then we don't have and then what? Or so now what?
Yeah. And so I love like just that he gives her that and create space for that. And so I do, right. I think that they're great resources. I do think that Brene Brown's emotional work is a great resource. I think Kristen Neff's stuff on self-compassion is really, really good.
Yeah.
I love Emily Nagoski's work, and I think that she does a great job of showing like what burnout looks like and why it's there. And I mean, and her sexual response cycle is a brilliant way to just kind of understand all of these like accelerators and brakes and why it doesn't always work the way we think it should.
Right.
And if you start like, and there are more authors, right? Like I have a list, a ridiculously long list. But if you're looking for a place to start, like that's where I would start. That's where I start people in terms of emotional intelligence and kind of.
And sometimes I'll have male clients say, well, this book was written for women. And I'm like, right. Because why do we think a male would understand women better than a woman author? But you're in a heterosexual relationship. So shouldn't you be reading this book to understand women instead of assuming that you understand women?
Yeah.
Because we know there's not necessarily a lot of biological differences between women, I mean, and men. There are some that make the profound differences.
Same parts, just organized differently.
Right. But it's not like men have a higher sex drive than women.
Right.
All of those types of things that we thought when we were reading the book, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Turns out that's not
None
accurate.
of it's true.
And there's a lot more similarities. And the differences mainly come from the socialization that men and women receive. And so again, I think even if a book is written by a woman and it's written for women, why wouldn't you want to know that information?
Yeah, read those.
Yeah.
Also, women have been reading books by men for centuries at this point. So like just do it. It's really entertaining. You get lots of information.
Right. There's a lot of, I think, more resources as we've started to evolve. I mean, I think we've seen this in TV shows, in movies. We're seeing this evolution. And, you know, in the books that the experts are writing. And so I think now is a great time to start to understand and learn and then start to apply what you're learning. That can be hard if you're not working with a professional, I will say. Because the books, again, gives you a lot of knowledge. It doesn't typically help you integrate that and make differences. And that's where I think professional help really can be beneficial.
And if you're looking for a therapist or a professional who like does this kind of work, right? Interview them, ask them, do they understand this? Because this is new for therapists too.
Right.
Like we're catching up too. And there are some of us that are doing that faster than others. So
at the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.